How about this weather? Yeah, isn't this what we wait for in Southeast Texas? Like, wait for that day before it to dip below 60. So last night I told my wife, I said, it's going to be sweater weather tomorrow. Like, I haven't had this bad boy out in a year. And I looked at it and was like, we got a rabbit, and don't judge me. I got like rabbit hair from last year on the sweater. It's like, I don't care, I'm wearing it. It's like, here's a little bit of spaghetti from last year. It's like, it don't matter, it'll come off. It's love it, and great to be able to see you here and to be able to worship together. And I wasn't going to promo this, but as I was standing out in the front, just watching people and greeting people come in, it's just so many people that I have yet to really get to know or talk to. So we just decided in November, I think it's the second week in November, I'm going to bring something back called New to Praise. And New to Praise is just a time that I get to sit down with people who are new to praise and just talk about the mission, the vision, the beliefs, the history of Praise Church. So we'll do it after the second service. Have a Jason's Deli Meal, and I'll just sit for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be a little Q&A. So we used to do this way back in the day, and I thought, just coming out of the pandemic like we have, and so many new people that I haven't got to just talk to, I'd love to get to meet with you, and talk with you, and answer any questions that you have. If that's something you're interested in, I'd love you to be a part of that. All right, so we're in the fourth Sunday of a series that we're talking about, In the Face of Suffering. Now, I know it's kind of a heavy topic. It is a heavy topic. If you're not suffering right now, then you are filtering this information a little differently than people who are suffering. So if you're not suffering, if you're clipping along in life and all is well, then you're mainly taking this information in intellectually. It's a little abstract. You're thinking, if I was suffering, this is how I would handle it. This is the source that I would go to. This is exactly, it's like you got this linear way that you would handle suffering. You're taking this information through the head. But if you are in a season of suffering, then you are filtering this differently. And you're filtering this through your heart. Not through just the head, you're filtering it through the heart. It could be raw, there could be emotions and feelings involved. And in fact, when you come here today and we talk about suffering, you take all this content and it is going through one filter, and it is the event that you're suffering from. It's the event that's causing a little bit of a difference. And you're asking the question, how am I going to get through this? And what is life going to be like from here on out? And since we've been in this subject, I've been able to talk to many of you guys, and you've talked to me about your moments of suffering, your moment of suffering, and I've been able to kind of just in my mind lump it together into three categories, and thought you'd find it interesting to know that here's probably the three most predominant categories that our church is finding itself in suffering. Number one, the loss of a loved one. Just dealing with the loss of a loved one. If you have lost a loved one within the past year, would you mind just raising your hand? Would you keep your hand up and just let us look around for a moment? Everybody, it's okay. Don't feel uncomfortable. Look around. This is your church family. I want you to see, because even raising our hand at this moment, there's something there. Okay, you can put your hands down. There's just raising your hands. You're like, oh, am I raising my hand right now? Is this really happening? The second category is dealing with marriages. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I don't know. You're right there. Conflict in marriages, separation, infidelity, the suffering in marriage. And the third category is just illness. Let's say just illness. It's illness. Like chronic pain. Could be physical or could be mental. I want us to understand and realize that there are two different ways that we're ingesting this information. Someone who isn't suffering, you're taking it in through the head and it's intellectual. But the person who comes in here and you say you're hurting, and it's a heart, it's the head and the heart, it's the heart, and it's through feelings. Alvin Plantinga is he's an American philosopher. And he said, in the presence of his own suffering or that of someone near him, the believer in God may find it difficult to maintain what he takes to be a proper attitude towards God. Faced with great personal suffering, he may be tempted to rebel against God, shake his fist in God's face, or even to give up belief in God together. But this is a problem of a different dimension. Such a problem calls not for a philosophical enlightenment, but a pastoral care. What I want you to hear Alvin saying is that when someone's going through suffering, it's not the words spoken, the logic spoken. It's not the intellect that needs to be touched or addressed. It's the heart, because he says it's not for philosophical enlightenment, but for pastoral care. Now, whether you believe 100% in what he's saying, I think there is truth in this that. And you know this, if you've ever suffered and you had someone come to your side and they just was telling you all these scriptures and platitudes, I don't say platitudes, scripture and platitudes is not the same, but telling you how you should think at this moment, you're like, you know what, I don't need to hear this. What I need presence is greater than platitudes sometimes. Yeah, hopefully you're following me at that time. Sometimes we say things to people who are suffering and they're the right things at the wrong time. Well, they're better off right now. God needed another angel. When the moment of suffering and your heart's hurting, that is not exactly probably what you want to hear or need to hear. So John Feinberg, he's a theological student. When he first read or heard about Plantinga's statement, he said, I thought as long as I had intellectual answers, I would be okay. So after becoming a teacher of theology at the graduate level, Feinberg then learned that his wife had Huntington's chorea, which is a progressive disorder that leads not only to a loss of voluntary bodily movements, but to memory loss, depression, and forms of dementia, hallucinations, paranoia. And then to add to that news about his wife, he was told that the disease is genetically transmitted and that his children would have a 50-50 chance of getting to the disease, although the onset of it wouldn't come on until the early 30s. And then he said, and he wrote, who was I to contest the Creator? As Paul says, and he brackets Romans 9:19 through 21, as Paul says, the creature has no right to haul the Creator into the courtroom of human moral judgments and to put him on trial as though he has done something wrong. God has total power and authority over me. And then he shifts, right? From that moment, he's talking intellectually. The Creator has no right to haul the Creator into the courtroom. And then he says, but I felt that somehow God had misled me, that he even tricked me. So what he's saying, who am I to call God and to question God and to be angry at God? That's the intellectual side. But then he closes and he says, I felt God had somehow misled me, even tricked me. So even though he knew his faith and theology intellectually, what he didn't do, his heart had felt like in some way that God had wronged him and that he had got the wrong end of the stick. And now here's the irony of the story. John Feinberg had written his master's thesis on the book of Job and his doctoral dissertation on the problem of evil. And what he realized is that he thought he understood it. He thought he intellectually had it all wrapped up. But when he was thrown into the middle of the fire and into the suffering, his heart began to feel different things. So here's a man that was scholarly, filled with biblical truth, but his heart didn't know how to access the information. His heart didn't know how to access what he believed. There wasn't a full, big, large passageway that led straight to the intellect. And we all know this. It's one thing to have the information in the warehouse of our mind, and it's quite another thing to have the heart apply that information to to our life. That's not just with suffering, that's with anything. We say we have these beliefs. This is what we believe about God. But yet to have our heart access that is another story. It's something altogether different. And access it in a way that would bring long suffering, or that would bring joy in the midst of trials, that would bring a peace that would go beyond our understanding, or that would bring that even in the midst of our suffering, there would be a deep, sweet, and I don't lightly use those words, but there would be a deep, sweet fellowship with your Creator. Even during the suffering, that there would be these moments of going, wow, God, I know that you're with me. So how do we do that? How do we access the information that we know, the warehouse of our mind, we have this information, but how does our heart access that information? We're told that in last week we talked about it, that Jesus, just like the 3 Hebrew children, there was a 4th man in the fire, that Jesus will get in the fire with you. How do we access that information? Because we know that someone says, Jesus is with you. It doesn't, if you've lost someone, it doesn't bring someone back. They're still gone. And if we say Jesus is with you when you're dealing with a chronic pain or illness that you know that if God doesn't intervene, it's not going to go away, and you wake up to pain. How does knowing that Jesus is with me in this pain, how does that make a difference? How do we access, how does our heart access that? How do we build a passageway to what we say we believe? And it's so important that we learn how to do this. And I'm going to give you a scenario, and I'm pretty confident that you're going to be able to identify with this scenario in some way or another. So let's just say you have a friend, a close friend, someone you dearly love, and you get a phone call that your close friend just lost someone unexpectedly, and that they're overwhelmed with shock and overwhelmed with grief. And you love them so much that you've got to get to them, and you want to help them out, and you want to do something that would help comfort them in some little bit of a way. So you go to their house and you open the door and you tell them, God is in control. God will not let you experience anything more than you can bear. Or over time, this pain will subside. Let's just say that's the approach you take. You take, I'm going to remind them of what we believe. So that's one scenario to your friends losing the loved one unexpectedly. Or let's say it's the second example, where you immediately go to their house because you have to be with them. You knock on the door, and they open up the door, and they've been sobbing, and you know they've been sobbing, and you look at them, and you don't say anything, but you wrap your arms around them, and you guys embrace for a moment, and you know at that moment you guys are together, and they know at that moment that you care, and you stay for hours, and you guys don't even have a whole lot of conversation. Sometimes you cry together, and sometimes you're just sitting on the couch looking at the walls. But you're together. So from my experience personally, from my experience of being there for people in times like this, I believe that the second scenario is more beneficial than the first scenario. And I have to ask why? Because if you've ever been suffering, or if you're in suffering, or you have suffered, and you had people come to you and they said, they gave you all these things that you know that you believe. And I'm not saying the belief's not important. I'm just saying the timing of the reminding is important. And they say, you know what? It's going to get better, and God's in control. You know that you just at some point, no one wants to admit this. No one wants to say this. You kind of get tired of hearing it. I know, but my heart hurts. And I ask, why is it that, I had a friend I found out, and I just take this from a personal example, that a family member passed away, or it wasn't passed away, they were in the hospital. It was an accident, and I go up to the hospital, I just want to be with them. And I didn't say a whole lot. We just sat. I just sat in the waiting room for a long time. And it was just something about being together. So why is that so much more comforting? Why is that more comforting than me giving these ideas and beliefs that we all know that we have, and we believe it? But why is it so much? Because I felt like that person knew that someone was with them and they weren't alone. At that moment, I was kind of like sharing, dividing, splitting this grief and saying, I'm going to put a little bit on my shoulders, and I know you got a lot on your shoulders, but I'm just going to be here. And I'm not going to say anything, but we're just going to sit here. And they also knew that that me being there was that I cared for them. Now let's add to that story just a little bit. Let's say that you, before hearing the news of your friend, a year before that, you experienced the same scenario. And now you're sitting with a friend a year later that experiences that. Does that even bring more comfort? And I think from all of our experiences, we'd say from personal experience and from how I've received it and how I've given it, I think so. And the reason why is because not only am I there in the presence and they're not alone, but they know that I know what it's like to be like them at that moment. Like you've experienced the same thing that I've experienced. I've shared with you many times. I could not relate with somebody who lost a father until I lost my father. But the moment the moment and thereafter I lost my father, and I heard about another friend of mine, a male friend particularly, that lost their father. So something within my heart that began like, oh man. And then when I would get with them, it seemed like there was more comfort that they received because they knew that I knew what it was like to be them at that moment. And it was like, not only was I there, but I was understanding to exactly what they were going through. Now, bringing this to the place of Jesus. Our faith and our belief tells us that we have that in the person of Jesus. Now we know, and most of us come to church within our warehouse knowing that God's with us, that He's in control, that He's never going to leave us. But we got to see, how do we access this? We know that if we can understand that, it may not change, it's not going to change the situation, but what it can do, it can change how we go through the situation. Because if we know that Jesus is with us, just like we're with a friend who's suffering, and that Jesus understands what it's like to be us, like a friend who's with us that knows what it's like to go through. It doesn't change the situation or the outcome, but what it does, it can change how we go through it. So let me just remind us of our theology. Here's the warehouse. We've talked about it a little bit in the past 3 weeks, but it's all about Jesus being with us. It's the incarnation and the cross. The incarnation and the cross. It has to be in the warehouse. It has to first be in the warehouse before our heart can access it. Like your heart's not going to access something that's not there. So in the warehouse, we know the incarnation. What does the incarnation tell us? That He wanted to be with us. Incarnation is Him becoming flesh. He wanted to be with us. You personalize it, He wanted to be with you. So could we just remind ourselves and tell ourselves that God came down because He wanted to be with you? Unbelievable, blow your mind. I hope that I can never say those words without in some sense it being that it doesn't move me. That God, this creator of the world, that holds the world together, holds it in the palm of His hand, cared enough so much about you that He would come down and lose all of His privilege. But we don't just think about the incarnation. He came down so that He could be lifted up on the cross. He came down so He could be lifted up. He came down because He wanted to be with you. He was lifted up on the cross. Therefore, He knows what it was like to be you. Because He experienced everything in the same manner as you suffer. I know it's hard to access. We go, right, why don't we understand this? I remember Legacy used to do the last days of Christ. And you'd walk through, during Easter, you'd walk through all the scenes of the cross. And I remember watching, they've got Jesus on the cross in this field, and the two people on the sides of them. And I'm sitting there, they the barricades, and you walk through, and I'm sitting and watching, and I'm just looking, and none of us are moved. I'm going, oh my goodness, we're watching a man on a cross. Like it hit me at this moment, like, whoo, is he eating popcorn? Oh, wow. He kind of looks like Jesus. So dissecting the scene. And I'm thinking, how is it that we can have these beliefs and not be moved? Because these beliefs are extreme. God came down. If God came down, what does that tell us? It tells us He wanted to be with us. He came down so He could be hoisted, lifted up on a cross to suffer. He's a suffering servant. What does that mean? He knows what it's like to be me. And so this is in my head. I have to always try to build passageways from my heart to the head, or from the head to the heart, to get the coin to drop. Because if it drops, it makes a big difference. If He came down, He wanted to be with me. He cares for me. If he was lifted up on the cross, He knows exactly what it's like to be me. He knows what it's like right now to be you. Listen to this scripture. This was written 700 years before Jesus came. 700-year prophecy by Isaiah, meaning God spoke to Isaiah, this prophet. And Isaiah spoke this out. a depiction of what Jesus' life would be like. He was despised and rejected by men, meaning he was hated and he was pushed away. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, acquainted with the emotions. As one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs, and he has carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for what reason? He was crucified for our iniquities. Look at this. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. You know what that means? Our peace is sourced from his suffering. Your comfort is sourced and is possible because he suffered. He suffered so that you could have peace. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds, and by his wounds, we are healed. By his wounds, you are healed. We could go to the New Testament, 30 to 40 years after the crucifixion. The author of Hebrews writes, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens," and then he wants to make sure we know exactly who this is, Jesus, the Son of God. "Let us hold fast our confession." Let us hold fast to the words that we speak about our beliefs. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize." That means we don't have one who's unable to be touched by what we're going through, unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. The Greek for weakness means our frailty, our suffering, our calamity. But we have one who in every respect has been tempted. And that word tempted is translated as tested. Every respect has been tested, as we are, yet was without sin. So here's the conclusion, and here's your conclusion. Let's start building a road right to our beliefs, from our heart to the head. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So here, with what we just read, that he's been tempted and tested by everything. He can sympathize with our weaknesses. Since that is true, here's the conclusion. Let's just go ahead and draw near to the throne of grace with confidence. That confidence means with total and complete freedom. Let's just walk into the throne room of God with total freedom, with total boldness. Just like my children do, right into my room. It doesn't matter if I'm sleeping, Dad. If I have M&Ms, they just take the M&Ms from. It's like boldness and freedom that what Dad has is mine. Let's just walk into that right now and say, God, you have experienced everything that I have experienced. So therefore, you said that we can come and approach you to find help in our time of need. And we can come before you with confidence, in total freedom, with assurance, boldly. You care for us in our time of need. Martin Lloyd Jones, he said, "We are not to expect that God will exempt Christians from suffering in inner darkness, nor that he will simply lift us out of our darkness as soon as we pray. Rather than expecting God to remove the sorrow and replace it with happiness, we should look for a glory. We should look for a glory." And he says, here's what glory is, and he defines it for us. We should look for a taste and a conviction and increasing sense of God's presence. We should look for a taste and conviction and increasing sense of God's presence that will help us rise above the darkness. We should look around and say, God, where are your thumbprints on this? Where are you in my situation? Because if you could see God, if you could see that God is with you, if you would know, see, he's already proven that he will be with us. But if you could see that he is with you, the thumbprints, the conviction, and the increasing sense of his presence, it will help you rise above the darkness. Are you noticing? Are you noticing how God is showing up in your life? If you're suffering right now, are you aware of how God is showing up? Are you seeing that God is working through a friend of yours to call you? God, maybe that's not just my friend. Maybe that's your way of showing me that you care. God has to use, 90% of the time, he could do what he wants to do because he's God. But most of the time, he uses human agents to show that he's with you. So is someone giving you a call? Did someone text you? Did someone send you a letter, a card, flowers? Did someone take you out? Is there a worship song that speaks to your heart right now? Is there a family that's gathering around you right now where you feel super loved? Is there something that is there that is encouraging? If there's an ounce of encouragement, then there is a lot of God in the suffering. And the question is are we and do we have eyes to see, God, you're with me? Does that take the suffering away? No, Martin Lloyd-Jones says, no, it doesn't take the suffering away. But what it lets you know, it reminds you that God is right there with you while you're suffering. And if you know God is with you, David said, I can walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Why? You're with me. It's not that God's not ever going to be with you. He's always with you. It's like, do we have eyes to see that God is with us? Because the characteristic of God is that he is at all places at all times. So if we don't see God, a God that is all places at all times, we're not seeing. So it's like, am I aware? God, maybe you're speaking to me through all types of things. I don't know. I'm just saying, in your context, how is God ministering to you right now? And are you seeing? Has he surrounded you by friends, family, a group that's speaking into your life? Because if you could see that it's not just the friends, that it's God working through your friends, it's like, God, thank you so much for your care for me. Because you know what we have in the warehouse of our mind? Here's what we know. This is not new to anybody. Hebrews 13:15. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. We know that. But why do we feel forsaken sometimes? Why do we feel like, God, where are you? Are you not listening to me? Because we don't have always access from our heart to what is in our head. So, in Jesus, here's what we've said. In Jesus, God came to earth to be with us because he wanted to be with you. In Jesus, through Jesus, God suffered for us, meaning that he knows what it's like to be us. Edward, I think his last name would be Shillito. I believe he wrote this poem after World War I. And it's just the last, I think it's the last stanza of it, or it's a stanza. He says, the other gods were strong. The other gods were strong, but thou was weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but thou alone. So it's from his wounds that our wounds are ministered to. So I want to close with a familiar story about Lazarus. You know the story if you grew up in church. You've heard the story of Lazarus. Lazarus had sisters Mary and Martha, right? And Lazarus got sick, and Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus because Jesus was in a neighboring city. Said, look, Lazarus, and he says, the one that you love is sick. And Jesus didn't go immediately. And it's like 3 days he gets there and Lazarus passed away. And when Jesus gets there, have you ever felt like Jesus showed up in your life a little too late? And that's what they felt like. Jesus was showing up a little too late. And they were upset. John 11, John was a good friend of Jesus, had a lot of insight into Jesus' life, saw this stuff happen. He writes, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, listen, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, and here's what she said to him. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Like if you would have just showed up. You know that magic you work, you know the powers that you have? If you would have just come, Lazarus, my brother and your friend, would still be here. So you could hear the disappointment and the hurt in her voice. And when Jesus saw her weeping, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then verse 35 says, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. There's a part in here that we read over. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and he was greatly troubled. And he said, "Where did you lay him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And simply says, Jesus wept. I must ask this question. Why did Jesus weep? Why did Jesus crying? Like, why is there water coming from the Son of God's cheek? Is it because Lazarus died? Is it like normal grieving over the death of a friend? And I'd argue no, because he knows he's about to raise him from the dead. It's pretty clear. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the one who had come, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and he was greatly troubled. Commentators believe that translation is way too weak, that we took the Greek and we couldn't come up with an English translation of it that has the emotion. They say that where it says he was deeply moved, that literally means, listen to this is unbelievable, the Son of God would be moved by the weeping of somebody else like this. It says it meant to bellow with anger, to snort, literally means to snort with displeasure, anger, and indignation, that he would burn with anger against the oppressor of men. So at that moment, if this is true, and that commentator is right, it means that Jesus is experiencing emotions that he is so furious at evil, he is so furious at death and suffering. This means that the evil is the enemy of God's good creation and of God himself. And that at that moment, as he sees his friends weeping, and that they are the victim of a tarnished, perverted world, broken world, that it hurts his heart that the creation of his Father is experiencing the oppression right now. And he could have, if he wanted to, he could have rode into town and he could have come down like a general in the army, and he could have kicked everybody's rears, and he could have like defeated evil if he wanted to at that moment. But if he would have, we would have had to go with him because of the evil inside of us. But what he did do is he came down and he paid for the evil of our sins and the payment of our sins, so that someday he will return again to wipe out all evil without having to wipe out you. Because he took care of the penalty of evil. Last week we talked about Elizabeth Elliot. I'm going to close out with a quote by hers that I mentioned last week, and I think it's so powerful. She said, "Those hands that keep 1,000,000 worlds from spinning into oblivion were nailed motionless to a cross for us." And then she closes with the question, can you trust him? Can you trust him? So in researching today, people don't think that trust and belief are synonymous, or many don't. You can have belief but not trust. And I just wanted us to spend a few moments today talking about how do we build that pathway from here to where the coin would drop to our heart, so that when we suffer, it doesn't take the pain away, but there can still be joy, there can still be peace, long suffering, there can still be sweet, sweet, deep fellowship with God. You could wake up and say, it's going to be a tough day, but it's a good day. God is with me. And it's not just saying it because that's what you've always been told. Because the truth is, if you've been to church, no one came into this house today not knowing that God wasn't with you. For as long as you've been in church, you've been told that. And you're not going like, oh, that was news. Oh, God's with me? He died for me? Why do I speak on this? Why? Because here's the simplicity of it. We know it. We have the belief. But our heart finds it hard to trust sometimes. And hopefully at this moment, I would hope all of us could experience, and I pray before you leave, you'll experience this, that there would be greater trust. Not because, just because we've talked about it and you said, oh, thanks for reminding me. Thanks for just taking a moment for us just to try to build a road back from my head to my heart so it would speak to my heart and it would encourage my day and I would live through it. And I'm just here to tell you, God cares for you, right? It's not that you didn't know that. You just need to be reminded of that. Why did I ask you to say God is in control? Because you're just telling your heart that again. You're just telling it, reminding your heart. It's just saying, here's what I believe. I'm trying to get it here. I'm just working it down. I'm working it down. I'm working it down till it gets here. He cares for you. And He knows what it's like to be us. He knows what it's like to lose people that's close to Him. He knows what it's like to have someone walk away and betray Him and turn Him in. He knows what it's like to experience excruciating, that's where the crucifixion comes from, the word excruciating pain, beyond our belief. He knows what it's like. And the reason He knows what it's like is because He did it for you. And He did it for me. So that one day, He can right all wrongs without getting rid of us.